let me read from the brief biographical profile of our next speaker. He was born in 1964. He is a senior lecturer at the philosophy department at the University College Cork, Ireland. His research focuses on Chinese and comparative philosophy and on the social theory of Niklas Luhmann. Among his book publications are Taoism Explained, From the Dream of the Butterfly to the Fishnet Allegory, which was published in 2004. The Philosophy of Tao Beijing in 2006. Luhmann Explained, From Souls to Systems in 2006. Radical Luhmann, which is his most recent book, I guess, published just this year. And The Moral Fool, A Case for Amorality, published in 2009. Currently, our speaker is the president of the Académie du Midi. His lecture, or the lecture that he has prepared for us today, is entitled Moral Philosophy and Its Critics in Greece and China. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce to you Professor Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to friend and colleague Dr. Koh for having me here, but more importantly for providing this wonderful forum for the Académie du Midi to present itself here as a society that is trying to pursue some similar goals as this very conference, namely to promote philosophical dialogue between Eastern and Western traditions. And my paper this morning is also an attempt within this larger field. In my paper, I'm going to discuss two types of morality. I will introduce the first type, which I call a morality of inclusion, by referring to the rather famous analysis of justice and just society in Plato's Republic. Then, secondly, I will argue that an alternative form of such a morality of inclusion can be found in Chinese philosophy as well, namely in Confucianism. Then going back to the Western tradition, I will introduce a second type of morality, which I think is also alluded to in Plato's Republic, but is particularly evident in Plato's Apology. And this type of morality I call morality of exclusion. Morality of exclusion, as I will show, can be conceived of with Hegel as the result of a dialectical criticism of the morality of inclusion. And in a further dialectical turn, he criticized itself. Well, in my view, there was no equivalent dialectical development in Chinese moral philosophy. There appeared, in the form of a Taoist negative ethics, an amoral criticism of the Confucian morality of inclusion. After these East-West historical observations, I will conclude with what may be called a short New Taoist defense of amorality. So, now to the morality of inclusion in Plato's Republic. As it is well known, Plato's Republic is an extremely complex philosophical text addressing fundamental ontological, ethical, and psychological problems, as well as more specific issues of, for instance, government, education, and art. The initial philosophical problem of the Republic is the definition of justice, which is, of course, also a core moral problem. After several more or less sophist efforts to define justice are dismissed and deconstructed by Socrates, he himself endeavors to explain what justice is and his lengthy and detailed excursions into social theory, pedagogy, and even into the underworld are supposed to be the necessary contextual framework for giving a true account of real justice. To use Socrates' own imagery, he tries to philosophically hunt down justice by firstly finding out what a just society would look like, and then secondly, by inferring from this example of the just state what a just person is, and thus what the very nature of justice is. Famously, justice in the state is, according to Socrates, provided by a just distribution of social functions, which are to assign every member of society his or her proper role in the state. There are three main roles in society: production, military, and government. And when the social boundaries between these roles are firmly established, a just society will result. Socrates says, quote, "Meddling among the classes, of which there are three, and exchange with one another is the greatest harm for the city, and would most correctly be called extreme evildoing," end of quote. And he continues, then that's injustice. Again, let's say it this way: the opposite of this, the money-making, auxiliary, and guardian classes doing what's appropriate, each of them minding its own business in a city, would be justice and would make the city just, end of quote. So, justice will prevail in a society once all social groups are acting in accordance with their essential nature and thus combined into a harmonious social whole without friction. The occurrence of injustice in such a society has been structurally prevented. It will be impossible for any injustice to arise simply because the general pattern of society is a pattern of justice. The notion of justice refers to the organization of the whole of society. The society is just, it is the primary subject of justice. Because society as such is just and morally good, every individual living in such a just or good society will partake in an overarching framework of justice and goodness and morality. The organization of the just state is then, by analogy, translated into the organization of the just individual or the just person. Just as a society becomes just and morally good by a proper organization of its elements, the human soul will be just once its constitutive elements are structured in the proper way. In perfect correspondence to the social body, the human person is also supposed to consist of three parts: a rational one, which is supposed to rule; a spirited one, which is supposed to be obedient to it and its ally; and finally a desiring one, which has to be controlled and subdued by the other two elements. Once proper division and hierarchy between the constituents of the soul is established, the soul will be just as good as the good state, and the possibility of immorality will have been structurally eliminated from the soul and thereby from the individual and the person. Obviously, justice is seen as a result of constructing a perfect whole out of potentially conflicting elements, both in the state and the soul. Socrates points out again and again that this is how health and order are to be achieved, and how sickness and disorder are to be prevented. He says that, I quote, "There is one form of virtue and an unlimited number of vice. There is only one perfect pattern of harmony, but there are innumerable patterns of disarray. There is only one way of putting the jigsaw puzzle correctly together. Either you get it just right, or you miss it altogether. And the one rightness depends entirely on putting each element at its proper place within the whole. The whole is precisely one absolute unity, incorporating all individual elements into a coherent whole. This is what makes a society good and a person moral. This is the essence of justice and of morality. That multiplicity is organized in the only proper way into a perfect unity. This morality is based, so to speak, on a Parmenidean ontology of oneness and being. Justice, as Socrates puts it, lies in becoming, and I think this is probably the most important quote, becoming entirely one from many. The ascent from the many towards the one, the harmonious integration of the many, the overcoming and abolishment of multiplicity, the dialectical Aufhebung of the many into the one, the transformation of becoming into being. This is what the first type of Platonic Socratic justice and morality amounts to. One is virtue, and vice is many. This conception of morality is, as I dare to speculate, an ontological inheritance of pre-Socratic ontology. This type of morality can therefore be classified as a morality based on unity. Justice and morality, going along with a paradigm of unity, are based, with respect to society, on social inclusion. Again, think of the image of the jigsaw puzzle. Everything has to be included into the whole, and this can only happen, and this can only work if every single element is at its proper place, and is included thereby into the whole. And if it's not in its proper place, inclusion does not take place, or inclusion doesn't work. So, members of society become moral beings by integrating themselves into the social whole, by abolishing any tendency towards disintegration. Integration into the one is the only way to bring about the just state and the moral person. Because morality is structurally and ontologically, which is very obvious in Plato's context, grounded in unity, integration is a necessary aspect of the realization of the moral society and the moral soul. Morality and justice result from the harmonious integration of the many into the one. Integration into society becomes possible by a pattern of social distinctions. In the state, every individual is supposed to perform his or her integration by self-socialization through the acceptance of a specific social role. By identifying oneself with a specific compartment of the social whole, one realizes one's moral duty of integration. The pattern of the distinct social spheres is, as mentioned before, hierarchical. Order and unity are the result of the supposedly natural domination of certain social compartments over others. It is the moral duty of the individual to accept one's position in this pattern without, again, quote, meddling among the classes. Reversions within the hierarchical pattern of the many are damaging and will ultimately destroy the unity and health of the social or the human body, and thus eventually kill it. The individual who doesn't live up to the obligations naturally attached to its role violates the social body and affects the well-being of the whole. Immorality is a category dependent on social distinctions. What is moral and what is not is defined by the distinctions within the whole, by the specific characteristics of the various social compartments. In these circumstances, the individual's morality is related to the whole. Morality is social, and therefore violations of morality are social too. It is politically immoral for a state when those who have the qualities to rule refuse to rule. And it is equally immoral for a state to be ruled by those who are unworthy of ruling. Similarly, a person who is unable to control him or herself rationally will not avoid moral deficiency, just like everybody who is overcome by his or her desires will become immoral. So, now to a different kind of morality of inclusion in the Confucian context. Platonic Socratic morality of integration and inclusion has for sure many comparable counterparts in various cultures, historical epochs, and one of them is the ethical philosophy found in the Analects of Confucius. For looking more closely at the ethics in the Analects, I would like to stress that despite the structural parallels between Plato and Socrates on the one hand and Confucius on the other, there remain quite substantial differences between the two sides. To name just one specific but highly significant example for these differences, while Socrates in the Republic explains in detail why and how the basic family structure, namely the unit of parents and children, has to be dissolved in a truly just society, Confucianism in general Confucius in particular, viewed the family as the most foundational and entirely indispensable social institution for an ethically healthy society and the moral excellence of individuals. This difference alone is so decisive that it makes the concrete ethical prescriptions advocated in the Republic and in the Analects, respectively, largely incompatible with one another. When comparing the Analects and the Republic, I thus do not intend to suggest that their ideals of a moral community or a moral person are essentially similar, but only to highlight that despite arriving at very different specific moral recommendations, they nevertheless share, generally speaking, the focus on an ethics of social inclusion. In addition, both Confucian and, at least in the Republic, Platonic morality conceived of the perfect society as a harmoniously integrated unit, and within this unit there was supposed to be a hierarchical order between distinct social roles. Inclusiveness and hierarchical order were in both cases believed to be an indicator of health, and this was again for both related to the social as well as to the individual physical body. Now, Henry Grossman and Roger Ames have labeled Confucian moral philosophy a form of role ethics. If I'm not mistaken, my understanding of Confucian morality based on social inclusion very much in accordance with their conception of role ethics. The individual is the center of relationships, cannot be separated from the social context in which he or she exists. In this sense, the individual not merely plays one or several roles, but essentially is and is nothing but his or her roles. If, for example, I'm a father and a husband and a teacher, then what I am is essentially determined by these roles I have in relation to and with others, my children, my wife, my students. There's nothing that would constitute purely me in isolation and disconnected from these and other roles that I have in society. My identification with my roles does not, as Roseman and Ames frequently point out, mean that I lack uniqueness. Each individual is constituted by its own and constantly changing social roles. My roles are different from your roles, and thereby I am different from you. To be identified by one's roles does not mean to lack a specific identity. It only means, and this is what I intend to highlight here, that in Confucianism, identity formation is based on the specificity of one's personal social inclusion. In the Analects, as well as in other Confucian, non-Confucian texts, Confucian role ethics is tied to the concept of the rectification of names, or zhongming in Chinese. The most famous and most succinct passage in the Analects related to this concept is found in section 1211. When Confucius is asked by a ruler about order in society, the master replies, "The ruler must rule, the minister, the father, and the son, son." Social order depends on everyone living up to the roles that one's names, which means one's social designations, indicate. The roles are not autonomous, but relational, and they are typically hierarchical relations, such as the one between ministers and rulers and fathers and sons. These constitute society and social life, and not individual people. Individual people will often be fathers and sons and superiors and inferiors at the same time, depending on with whom they are together. Thus, society is not a sum of separate human beings, but the whole enactment of social relationships in the world. Concretely, society does not consist of an abstract me and abstract yous, but for instance of concrete social relationships as the one we are having right now between me as writer or speaker and you as readers or listeners. And that relationship, of course, will soon change when you speak and I listen. According to this, society is not conceived to be primarily constituted by individuals bearing names such as Hans or Alfredo, but by the enactment of social roles named speaker and listener. This is what the expression forms and names means in the Confucian context. To act or perform in accordance with the name of one's social role or one's title. We can have a harmonious conference if our speakers, when they are supposed to speak, and the listeners listen. And if they don't, then our conference will not be very harmonious. In line with the social determination of a person's identity, a person's moral excellence is measured by his or her ability to perform one's social roles well. Confucian role ethics represents, therefore, another type of morality of inclusion. Just as my social relations constitute me as a person, my ethical rank is determined by my successful integration into social relationships. As it is obvious from Confucius' short proclamation cited above, order, and thus ethical excellence, is not something that can be achieved individually, but is a social product. Not so different from the Republic, moral excellence is simply unattainable individually. It can only become manifest in a social dimension. Just as in the Republic, moral excellence is the result of orderly and mostly hierarchical relations between parts. It is not something that can be achieved by each part on its own. In this way, morality is inclusive. You can't be, in this context, a moral being on your own and in separation from society. In the Analects, much more so than in Plato's works, the morality of inclusion is related to the cultivation of shame. Morally cultivated persons, it was thought, would act correctly because they would correctly feel shame. Many passages in the Analects contain instructions on what to feel ashamed about, and, of equal importance, what not to be ashamed of, such as, for instance, being poor. In general, Confucius morally approves of, quote, those who conduct themselves with a sense of shame, end of quote. Shame is the emotional reaction to social misbehavior, or in the vocabulary that I'm using in this article, to failed social inclusion. We are supposed to feel shame if, for instance, we behave impolitely, if we dress inappropriately, or eat in an undignified way, and so forth. And because then we cause social disharmony. Someone who has cultivated his or her sense of shame well will more or less naturally refrain from such awkward behavior and include him or herself smoothly. For instance, in such everyday activities as eating, in whatever social situation he or she is in. In this way, the feeling of shame is the emotional quality in humans that makes social harmony possible, and that the Confucian variety of morality is dependent upon. Now going back to Greece and the criticism of such a morality that I think we can find in other works by Plato. So I want to discuss now the second type of morality, which I believe has hardly any structural counterpart in ancient China. Type of morality which is no longer based on inclusion, but rather on exclusion. This second type of morality presents not only an alternative to the first type, but can also be seen in a dialectical fashion as an antithetical, a critical response to the first type. The famous allegory of the cave in the Republic is not only an epistemological and metaphysical allegory, it is also an ethical one. There's only one person among all the prisoners in the cave who is set free and gets to see the sun of truth. And this single man meets a singular fate. He has to return to the darkness and to the people lying in chains in order to bring them the message of truth. But these lowly creatures down there in the cave are lazy and mean. They prefer to continue their unenlightened existence. Badly enough for the good man who has seen the real world, the cave dwellers do not only show no interest in the tales of their teacher, they even begin to feel annoyed by his tireless efforts to turn them around, and they soon no longer merely laugh at him, but scorn him, and may eventually kill him if this is the only way of silencing him. This is, as Socrates explains in the Republic, the inevitable fate of the moral man who has seen the light of truth and who knows what is right. He will be scorned, or as Socrates also explains, might be compelled to court or even murdered. The Apology fulfills this prophecy of the allegory of the cave. And here we witness how Socrates himself, the most moral and wisest of all, is brought to death by the cavemen of Athens. Like the Republic, the Apology too is about the conflict between the morality of the one and the immorality of the many. But unlike in the discussion of justice in the Republic, here, the one is no longer the social unit, but the single individual. The Socrates of the Apology no longer represents the oneness of society. He has turned into a true moral subject. Right from the beginning of the Apology, when Socrates confronts his prosecutors and judges in court, he leaves no doubt about where he positions himself in relation to them. He is on his own, obviously, and he states that his prosecutors are many. Interestingly enough, Socrates, the accused, takes pains to emphasize that his prosecutors in reality outnumber by far those actually present at court. The hundreds of enemies who are present are obviously not quite enough for him. So many more throughout his life have accused him, and these, although absent, he also intends to address. Once the verdict against him is spoken, Socrates seems disappointed that only relatively few have voted against him. He had thought there would be more. I quote, "I thought the majority against me would have been far larger," he says. Still, it was, luckily one can say, a majority. Otherwise, it seems Socrates, the moral man, would have been in trouble, since in the Apology, the moral man is necessarily opposed to the many. Morality sides with the individual, and the multitude appears as immoral. In line with this, Socrates insists that not even one of his family members be brought to the court in his support. I quote, "I have a family, yes, and sons, O Athenians, yet I will not bring any of them here in order to beg you for acquittal." Socrates wants to be alone. The morality of the single individual is, of course, no longer a morality of inclusion. It is quite to the contrary one of exclusion. Socrates is not only alone, he is also different. He describes himself as, in his own words, a stranger among the Athenians, even though, of course, he is actually Athenian. He says that he speaks differently than they do. Of course, he speaks the same language as them. And he continuously complains that he is not understood by the others. And when he's asked to suggest a punishment for himself, he goes on to explain how different such a punishment must be in his specific case because of his personal uniqueness. He says, I quote, "What is that which I ought to pay or to receive? What shall be done to the man who has never been idle during his whole life, but has been careless," and this is important, "of what the many care about?" End of quote. By pointing out his different attitude towards life, his particular lifestyle, his special dislikes and dislikes, Socrates implicitly shows that there is no one like him in Athens, and thus that the Oracle of Delphi was probably true when it stated that there was no one else in Athens as wise and moral as he. He's different from Athenian society since he knows how to correctly distinguish that which is true from what is merely apparent, as opposed to all of his contemporaries who got this distinction wrong all the time. In order to be true and moral, Socrates excludes himself from an untrue and immoral society. And in this self-exclusion, he goes to the utmost extreme. He chooses the death penalty for himself, avoiding every possible alternative, from fines to exile to flight. The more radical and obvious his exclusion from society, the more radical and obvious is his morality. In his final sentences in the Apology, Socrates points out that his execution will reveal the truth, not only about himself, but also about Athens. It will show for once and for all that he and Athens, the single individual and the society of the many, do not go together. The many of Athens will go on to live in immorality and untruth, while he will go on to die in morality and truth. Socrates finally proves with his death that truth and morality can only be obtained outside of Athenian society. The Apology establishes a new morality of the single individual, a new morality based on exclusion and otherness. Especially in a cross-cultural comparative context, it is interesting to note that the Socrates in the Apology makes a point about his shamelessness. If, for him, morality is based on truth and its recognition and practice by the individual, why should he bother about arbitrary social customs and conventions? Socrates is not ashamed for appearing odd to his Athenian fellow citizens, and not even for making them feel uncomfortable. He rather prides himself to be their stinging gadfly. Not only is Socrates not ashamed of being different, but in distinction to his society, he refuses to accept shame as an indicator of moral indecency altogether. He does not mind to do what is shameful. He happily accepts public ridicule and even punishment. He does not particularly respect traditional religious practices or codes of manners. For him, immorality cannot be measured by shame. Instead, it has become a matter of guilt. The verdict against him, according to Socrates, does not prove, as it would be expected, on the basis of the morality of inclusion, that he is immoral because he is openly disregarded by his community. To the contrary, the verdict proves, from the perspective of the morality of exclusion, that Athens has accumulated guilt. Quote, "The difficulty, my friends, is not in avoiding death, but in avoiding evil. For evil runs faster than death. I am old and move slowly, and the slower runner has overtaken me. And my accusers are keen and quick, and the faster runner, who is evil, has taken over. And now I depart hence condemned by you to suffer the penalty of death. And they, too, go their ways, condemned by the truth, to suffer the penalty of wickedness. I must abide by my award, let them abide by theirs." Socrates happily chooses to be the victim in order to establish this difference between him and society, between him and the everlasting guilt of his opponents. The Apology not only contrasts Socrates, the single individual, with the Athenian multitude, it also contrasts the moral subject with a society ruled by conventions. In this way, it contrasts a morality of exclusion with a morality of inclusion. The type of ethics of the Apology, therefore, is not only an alternative to an ethics based on social inclusion, it's also a powerful criticism of the very concept of such a morality. The two moralities represented by Socrates in the Apology on the one hand and in the Republic on the other are not simply two variations of a similar ethics. In fact, the former sets out to destroy and replace the latter forever. Both Platonic Socratic moralities have been influential in the history of Western ethics. The morality of inclusion and of social cohesion had its philosophical and specifically its political heritage. One may, for instance, trace Marxist ethics back to the Socrates of the Republic. On the other hand, the morality of exclusion and of the moral subject, brought forth by the Socrates of the Apology, may well be understood as a precursor of at least some later Christian ethics. Both types of ethics have not only been varied and modified in numerous ways, they also have met with profound criticisms. I will now take a look at a criticism of the Platonic Socratic morality of exclusion that I find particularly interesting, namely the one by Hegel. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, having the Apology in mind, Hegel calls Socrates the inventor of morality. Hegel portrays Socrates as the first moral man who did not simply follow the customary morality of ancient Greek society, but, in Hegel's word, posited the individual as capable of a final moral decision. End of quote. This new revolutionary morality challenges the fundamentals of traditional society, insofar as Hegel remarks, the death penalty for Socrates was of unimpeachable rectitude, since Athenian society did nothing else but condemn its, again in Hegel's words, deadliest foe. However, as Hegel also remarks, this penalty could not annul the new invention of the moral man, and thus by pronouncing Socrates guilty, Athens and the old morality also pronounced itself guilty in the eyes of the new morality of subsequent times. Indeed, the death of Socrates in the Apology turns out, in a dialectical fashion, to be the death of the old Athenian society and its ethics. Seen in this way, Socrates' strategy was a total success. By victimizing himself, he established a new ethics of the moral subject. Thus, eventually, his opponents became the true losers. I believe that one can find traces of Hegel's analysis of Socrates as early as in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and in a passage of the chapter on, again, what Hegel entitled this chapter, The Law of the Heart and the Frenzy of Self-Conceit. This chapter is usually interpreted as a criticism of Rousseau. But here I will read this text as at least implicit criticism of the Socrates of the Apology. Some of you are familiar with the phenomenology will know that Hegel often refrains from actually naming the people or characters he's referring to. Well, so nevertheless, in that passage, Hegel also speaks about the moral man, the individual who no longer follows the ethical law of the many, but rather, in Hegel's words, knows that it has the universal law of law immediately within itself. And because the law is immediately present in the being for self of consciousness, it is called the law of the heart. End of quote. The emergence of the moral man with his law of the heart produces, in Hegel's terms, again, the contradiction of the general law and the individuality. Hegel does not only present us with this conceptual analysis of the appearance of the moral man, he also offers a quite Nietzschean psychological analysis of this new personality type. The moral man, according to Hegel, is characterized by, I quote, the earnestness of a high purpose, which seeks its pleasure in displaying the excellence of its own nature and in promoting the welfare of mankind. End of quote. All this seems to me a quite adequate description of the Socrates in the Apology and of the Savior of mankind in the cave allegory. The moral man, driven by his law of the heart and fascinated by his own excellence, will, as Hegel explains, eventually, after dialectical development, end up in a frenzy of self-conceit. Hegel calls it in German, Wahnsinn des Eigendünkels. The moral man, who is so assured of his individual moral qualities, and who invests so much rhetoric in establishing the difference of his new exclusive morality from the old inclusive ethics of the many, ends up with taking his superb individuality a step too far. His Eigentlichkeit, or exclusive uniqueness, becomes, in Hegel's terms, sheer Eigendünkel, or self-conceit. It manifests itself as a historic pose of the philosopher who insists so much on his originality that he becomes an example of presumptuous self-conceit. Psychologically speaking, the Hegelian deconstruction of the dialectics of the law of the heart and its frenzy of self-conceit exposes the ambiguity of the moral man. It exposes his carnivalistic double nature of excessive dignity, which transforms itself into ridiculous madness. Therefore, it may indeed be the case that the caricature of Socrates presented in Aristophanes' Clouds is closer to the historic Socrates than one would expect from reading only Plato's works. Hegel had credited Socrates with the invention of the moral man. And here, one may follow Hegel and credit the Socrates of the Apology and the cave allegory of Republic with establishing a role model followed by many other moral individuals in the history of Western ethics. Of course, Hegel's credit was double-edged. It also undermined the moral man and allowed others like Nietzsche to look at this figure with even greater suspicion. After Hegel and Nietzsche, the moral man has lost his innocence, at least in the eyes of some philosophers. In society, however, for instance, in pop culture, one may think of many Hollywood movies, and in political speeches, the moral man seems to be still very much alive. Here we can witness on a daily basis, in Hegel's words, quote again, the earnestness of a high purpose, think of politician speeches, which seeks its pleasure in displaying the excellence of its own nature and in promoting the welfare of mankind, end of quote. In the preceding sections of my paper, I traced the development of a morality of inclusion with the Western philosophical tradition. Plato himself offers not only an alternative to, but a replacement of such a morality in his Apology, where Socrates appears as a spokesman for a morality of exclusion. Hegel, in turn, presents an interesting deconstruction of a morality of exclusion, when, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he demonstrates the dialectics of the moral man, whose law of the heart finally leads him to a frenzy of self-conceit. Now I intend to look at another critical reaction to a morality of inclusion, which, however, emerged in China and not in the Western context. As pointed out above, in the case of the Confucian morality of inclusion, ethics and emotions, or more precisely, ethical and emotional cultivation, are closely intertwined. In the Analects, the particular importance of filial piety or filial responsibility, xia, for such a project of moral cultivation is frequently stressed. Filial responsibility refers to the demand that one develop naturally appropriate emotional attitudes towards one's family members, such as affection and obedience towards one's parents, and love and care for one's children. Just as one was expected to include oneself harmoniously into one's family by developing healthy feelings for the other family members, one was later expected, on this foundation later in one's life, to include oneself in society by emotionally embracing one's various social roles and by enacting them properly and with ease, because one had developed this sort of emotional attachment. In this regard, as mentioned above, the cultivation of a sense of shame was considered vital. If people would only develop an appropriate sense of shame, it was hoped, social relations would naturally be harmonious and lead to social and thereby to individual flourishing and health. However, the belief that a morality of social inclusion based on feelings of shame would bring about a healthy society and healthy individuals was not shared by everyone in ancient China, and in particular not by Zhuangzi, the Taoist. One of the most often cited anecdotes from the Zhuangzi depicts the Taoist master at the occasion of his wife's death, quote, squatting and with his knees out, drumming on a pot and singing, end of quote. Zhuangzi's best friend Huishe then comes by to condole. When he sees Zhuangzi's strange behavior, he is rather dismayed and admonishes Zhuangzi. He says, when you have lived with someone and brought up children and grown old together, to refuse to bewail her death would be bad enough, but to drum on a pot and sing, could there be anything more shameful? Zhuangzi remains calm and replies that indeed, he says, when she first died, do you suppose that I was able not to feel the loss? Then, however, he explains, he was able to reflect on the constant alternation between life and death, which constitutes the course of the Tao of all things, so that after having cried for a while, he regained his emotional calm by affirming natural change. Huishe is, at least initially, deeply disturbed by Zhuangzi's reaction to the death of his wife. Although not even a Confucian philosopher himself, Moeller obviously in this situation shares with the Confucians the sentiment that not to mourn the passing of a close relative constitutes a grave violation of decency, or simply put, that such conduct is plainly immoral. In particular, he is appalled by Zhuangzi's apparent emotional deficiency, which seems to make him immune from feeling grief. To Moeller, Zhuangzi's behavior thus seems utterly shameful. But Zhuangzi does not share Moeller's common sense view on morality and shame. He admits that he too felt emotional pain when his wife died. But unlike as it is prescribed by the Confucian virtue of xiao, he did not think that such an emotional reaction was good or correct or appropriate. On the basis of the affirmation of change, Zhuangzi concludes that the cultivation of feelings of grief, even at such a serious occasion as the death of a loved one, is not the most healthy and natural way to react. In fact, it is implied the Confucian moral commandment to engage in protracted mourning rites is, from a Taoist perspective, simply an effect of a moralist misunderstanding of the course of nature or the Tao. In this way, instead of following the common conventions of the Confucian morality of social inclusion, and instead of reacting emotionally in a way that would be expected from a dutiful and well-cultivated moral husband, Zhuangzi acts amorally and unemotionally, but calm and in harmony with natural change, rather than in accordance with a specific set of social norms. This rather drastic anecdote shows Zhuangzi in blatant violation of one of the most central Confucian moral duties. This is the duty to mourn a dead family. Zhuangzi's behavior appears even more scandalous because of his emotional indifference, and in particular, his unashamed response to Moeller's admonitions. At first sight, one may therefore want to compare Zhuangzi's challenge to the Confucian morality of inclusion with Socrates' challenge to the Athenian morality of inclusion in the Apology. In my view, however, such a comparison would be misleading. I think that while Socrates reacts to the Athenian morality of inclusion by replacing it with another morality, namely one of exclusion, Zhuangzi simply demonstrates an amoral alternative to a moral approach to life. Similarly, Zhuangzi, while not feeling shame for what may appear immoral to others, makes no attempt to confront the society around him through outright shameless behavior in public. Unlike Socrates, he does not attempt to go out and teach his fellow men a lesson about what right mourning is. Like Mungsun Sai, another Taoist mourner without grief in another passage in the Zhuangzi, Zhuangzi does not confront Confucian morality directly, but simply refrains from taking it to heart. Thus, whereas we can find an antagonism between inclusion-based and exclusion-based moralities in the Western philosophical tradition, the Confucian inclusion-based morality is met by a Taoist amorality, or what I like to call a negative ethics. Within the Western tradition of moral philosophy, and this is my conclusion, one can identify a certain dialectics, or at least a confrontation between various types of ethics. One of them concerned with the morals of community, life, focusing on the inclusion of the moral person into society. Another one concerned with the moral conscience of the single individual, conceiving of ethics primarily as a business of the soul, or one's reasoning, and thus of morality as ultimately personal and potentially at least independent of social conventions. China, on the other hand, the Confucian ethics of social inclusion is met with a different counterpart, namely the Taoist defense of amorality. In my own attempt to come up with such a defense of amorality in the context of contemporary society and philosophy, I rely to quite an extent on Taoist philosophy as one of my main historical sources. For Taoism, and in particular for Zhuangzi, a major problem with morality relates to its pathological tendencies. Morality can make both individuals and groups sick. Taoism has always been concerned with issues of psychological, physiological, and social health. And I believe that this concern is a major reason for the Taoist praise of amorality. The Confucian obsession with moral values and norms, with ethical cultivation and language, is, from a Taoist perspective, at least potentially dangerous for the well-being of humans. Constant debates about right and wrong, as illustrated in the famous allegory of the monkey keeper in the second chapter of the Zhuangzi, seem ridiculous at best and fatal at worst. An ethical mindset and ethical communication aiming at distinguishing what is morally right from wrong can easily cause stress for individuals and conflict in societies. Or, in the words of the German 20th century sociologist Niklas Luhmann, I quote, "In normal, everyday interaction, after all, morality is not needed anyway. It is always a symptom of the occurrence of pathologies." End of quote. Not so different from how the early Taoists saw it, morality can be defined not as a quality of the soul or of the behavior of an individual, but as a form of judgment, or more precisely, as a specific distinction applied in thought and, more importantly, applied and trained in communication in society. Nietzsche as well looked at morality in this way when he stated that, I quote, "There are no such things as moral facts," and that, again, quote, "Morality is only an interpretation of certain phenomena, or more strictly speaking, the misinterpretation of them. Morality is merely the sign language," end of quote. Morality is not, from this perspective simply natural, and ethical terms do not denote something factual. To speak morally is to use the terms good and bad in an extreme sense, which is highlighted when we switch from using the word bad to using the word evil. To judge in such extreme terms, and to communicate in such extreme terms in a society, typically indicates tension and conflict. I therefore sympathize with Luhmann's suggestion to touch morality and ethical language only, I quote, "with the most sterile instruments and with gloves on, because it is such a highly contagious substance." Thank you very much.
So the talk of Dr. Moeller is indeed very interesting, and for sure it will broach the deluge of questions from the audience. At this point, I am officially opening the floor for questions.
Congratulations, Professor. How refreshing to hear an Irish accent again. So different from the English. May I tell you, I was once in Dublin and also at the Queen's University of Belfast. I am Jose de Villapos of the UNESCO. Now my question relates to a very interesting aspect of your talk, and that is this self-conceit. I'm rather attracted by this phrase, self-conceit, that you discussed in a rather interesting, not really sarcastic way. I was thinking, Professor, if by self-conceit I would read it as the awareness of this self. Sometimes we meet people with a very high level, etc., and we say, ang yabang, that is to say, how conceited. My interpretation of that is that the person is so aware of himself, which you said here, a self-conceit. I don't see how that can be a negative thing. Is that not related to what Nietzsche referred to as does he speak Superman? I don't want to go into that controversy. But my question is this. When a politician, I come from political science, international politics, international law. When a politician speaks on such a very high level, Of course, there is a kind of concept there. But is he not really challenging the audience to a higher dimension of themselves, their higher capability, challenge them to that higher level as a political leader? Jose Rizal was like this.
Excuse me, sir, I have to interrupt you. Sorry, sir, but we have to be direct to the point.
Here is the question now.
Yes, sir. What is the question?
The self-conceit, can this be related to an awareness of the higher self? And therefore, the politician is actually challenging the audience to the awareness of that high self. And that is good as far as society is concerned.
What fascinated me in Hegel's treatment of morality in this particular chapter in the phenomenology of spirit, that he intends something that is very modern, and that I think we then find later on in Nietzsche, maybe something like a psychological analysis of the moral man, of the moral person. What does morality do to a person? If one feels like very much morally excited, what does this do to a personality? What sort of character type do we end up? What is it, this moral person? And in this context of this question, Hegel uses this word of Eigendünkel, which is then translated into English as self-conceit. So I found this interesting because, again, Hegel in this chapter points out what I think many other philosophers, both in the Western tradition and then also back in the Chinese tradition in China, pointed out. Again, potential pathological effects that a moral mindset can have on an individual. So that actually a moral person may become a person that becomes in some ways very unpleasant. And actually there are lots of examples also in the German literature around the Karl Michael Kohlhaas, for example, which shows the effects of that moral self-conceit can have, the pathological self-conceit can have on an individual. And then again, we can also see this in a larger context when we look at a society that feels a high degree of sense of moral righteousness. That is, again, use the Romanian phrase, can be very much a symptom of the occurrence of pathologies. If you act on the basis of an extremely high degree of feeling morally not only justified, but perhaps even morally required to do certain acts, on this basis a lot of social conflicts can emerge. And we see, particularly in situations of conflict and war, the phenomenon of both on the individual and the social level of, let's say, increasing moral self-conceit.
Thank you very much for the important differentiation between inclusive and exclusive morality. It is, I think, analytically very helpful, but I doubt the conclusions you took from it. To your three objects, the first, Socrates. If I would leave the country, which they allowed him to do, secretly, I would do the same as they. I would be that would be treason. And he says, if I would do that, then the laws would come. The laws would come and would ask me, you have lived under us as long as it was good for you, and now when you have to do a sacrifice for us, you don't want to pay to us. And I think the laws, which he defends in the Platon and similarly defends in the Apology, are absolutely at the witness of inclusive ethics. So I think he makes clear that it can be in certain particular situations that one man is the only representative of the inclusive structure, like General de Gaulle, who in 1940 said, if my nation capitulates to Hitler, then I am the nation. And history has to decide. So, and concerning Hegel, of course there is the criticism of self-conceit and abstract morality in Hegel, but his principle of correction, his principle against morality, is what he calls ethics, the ethics which is institutionalized in human society. And nothing, I think, can be more inclusive than Hegel's theory of institutions, which is a theory of roles. Except one factor which is new, that's the factor of history. You have to include yourself not only in the roles, but also in the development of roles, which is guided by history, but then it's not at all an ethics of exclusion. And concerning Zhuangzi, I think we shouldn't overlook that Zhuangzi shares an aim with the interrogator. He says, well, in the beginning, of course I felt aggrieved, but then I regained moral stability and affirmation of nature. And it seems that he shares with moral people, at least, the aim to be in a calm mood and to affirm nature. And I wouldn't call this amoral. Amorality would consist in saying, well, you are moral, I am not. But as long as one, as a person who criticizes morality.
Of course, we find many different Socrates in Plato's works, I would say, right? So I'm not saying, this is, the true Socrates. It was the point of my paper to point out that Socrates assumes, let's say, a very different philosophical persona in various works, and sometimes even within one of the works. So you're referring to the Plato. That is a different work, and again, I was referring to that. So my aim is not, to find out, what is the true Socrates, but just to read the Apology with Hegel. I mean, this reading is taken basically from Hegel as an important philosophical text for presenting this, as Hegel says, as a text representing the invention of the moral man, in the sense that morality becomes basically an aspect of conscience rather than an aspect of the moral norms. And I think this is the decisive distinction, right? That morality is attached to conscience and to the pursuit of truth and goodness within the person, within the individual, that, if necessary, overrules the social norms. And this is something that is, at this point in history, I think, relatively revolutionary. And then, of course, from there on, we have a whole tradition of various forms of also mediation between the two, inclusive and exclusive models. So these are, of course, ideal, typical models, and you have all sorts of shades in between. Secondly, of course, I'm not saying that Hegel is an amoralist. Again, that was not my intention at all to point that out. But, as I said, what is interesting for me in these passages is that Hegel, and I'm just repeating myself, provides us with something that has been relatively unusual in moral philosophy, namely an attempt to look into, in Hegel's book, and not necessarily Hegel's work, but into the dialectics of, let's say, morality and the potential pathological effects it can have both on an individual and society. This sort of perspective on the complexity of morality as both the psychological and the social phenomena, I think is something that interests me in Hegel, right? Not trying to find out what is moral truth, what makes an act moral, what are morally correct statements, but how does moral thought, how does moral thinking affect an individual? What does it contribute to the development of an individual? What effects does it produce in an individual and society? That is what I found interesting there. And then thirdly, with respect to Zhuangzi, where I disagree, I think for Zhuangzi is very important, just like for the Confucians, and this line I would agree with you, there are many parallels between Zhuangzi and the Confucians. They both pursue, to put it very briefly, projects of what you could call cultivation, personal cultivation. And for the Confucians, this personal cultivation was, as I tried to point out, very much connected with the cultivation of feelings of shame, which was the main, let's say, mode of maintaining morality in the individual and in society. And what Zhuangzi tries to do is to develop a different mode of cultivation that is let's say, detached from the Confucian moral project of cultivation. So again, I would argue that I don't really have the time here to talk more extensively about it. That we are dealing there with different projects of cultivation, and one is a moral project of cultivation, and the other one is what I would call an amoral project of cultivation. And it's not an immoral project because it's not, against morality, but it is trying to pursue a different form of cultivation.
Thank you, Doctor. So we proceed with the next question. Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you a very short question. Namely, why do we call this Chinese reflection upon morality philosophy of morality? Because, philosophy belongs to a very specific way of knowing in the Western tradition. Why call this reflection philosophy? Why not call it, I don't know, even wisdom? But why philosophy? And it is a crucial for me question, and I think it would be good to make this point very clear. Thank you.
First, let me give a personal answer. I do not believe in the existence of such a single category as philosophy, right? That there is something that essentially is philosophy, and that there are other things that we can essentially say they are not philosophy. We still have this idea that, from perhaps we are misled here by our own language, that philosophy is like a single pursuit. We have now, in a pluralized and globalized world, get accustomed to the fact that we have a multiplicity of religion. And we have departments for the study of religions in the plural. There are still, I don't know of any department for the study of philosophies in the plural, so we still call it the study of philosophy. And I think that is quite problematic, particularly on an intercultural level. In order to have something like, in order for your criticism, to be valid, we would have to have at least some sort of agreed on definition of what philosophy is and what is not philosophy. And of course, first of all, we do not have this agreed on definition. If we would have one, and if we would thereby, for instance, exclude a lot of non-Western, let's say, traditions from being accepted into what is socially accepted as philosophy, I think that would be a very, unfruitful way of actually doing philosophy. So I think I would personally argue for, just as it happened with religion, to open up the term philosophy and allow for philosophy of being also a word that can be used in the plural. And in this sense, if we use the word philosophies in the plural, I think then it shouldn't be that difficult to include such traditions as the Confucian or the Taoist, or for that matter the Buddhist tradition, into that field, and to study these traditions with philosophical methods, which is what I'm trying to do. Right? Philosophy incorporates academic philosophy, a variety of methods to study texts, and I think we can apply these methods academically, and I do not think that any particular tradition of text is privileged for deserving this method, whereas other texts are not deserving of being analyzed with the methods prevailing in academic philosophy.
Thank you. I was just prompted earlier that we can accommodate only 2 more questions, but we have questions coming from Our Lady participants. Any questions from Our Lady participants?
Thank like to congratulate Dr. Moeller for his first nuanced reading in relation to and the distinction between inclusive morality and exclusive morality. Your analysis, sir, shows that indeed the Greek, even the Chinese understanding of morality as an elitist element. But I would like to ask whether or not, because your conclusion is that it's amorality, your conclusion is amorality in relation to the two prevailing models in your reading. I'd like to ask, do you have a minimum notion of the good so that precisely the critique coming from Greece and China would really have a valid impact in relation to the two models? Because I would like to know what would be the interface in relation to the fact that your conclusion is amorality. Do you have a minimum notion of the good, or what would be the minimum notion of an anthropology underlying the fact that your conclusion is amorality? Thank you.
What I try to do is to show somewhat, at least in the way I read Hegel in the phenomenology, to use the amoral perspective in order to look at the problems that arise from both exclusive and inclusive moralities, right? In the way I portray it, I don't know if that's like historically exactly accurate, but just for the matter of simplification, we can see that, somehow the exclusive morality appears in the history of philosophy and challenges the inclusive morality. So this is a typical thing, and again, from a Hegelian perspective, you can see this. We have one philosophical position which is challenged by another philosophical contradiction. There's one type of morality that is then challenged by another type of morality. And I think what is specific about Zhuangzi or about the amoral perspective, which, as I said, you also find in other thinkers that I quoted, is that it doesn't try, to contribute another sort of morality that now then is the right morality, whereas the previous moralities are wrong, but then rather in another Hegelian fashion, where he, for instance, also speaks about, philosophy of overcoming religion, that you no longer think, consciousness no longer looks at, religious thought as its, prime manifestation, but we have a shift from, let's say, religion to, in this sense, a religious philosophy, not in the sense that it is against religion, but it then operates in another mode and does not, come up with another religion which is now proposed to be the true religion, but to somehow incorporate, to outweaving is the term, to sublate the efforts of religion into what is then, let's say, a post-religious philosophy. In this sense, I think one can also comment, at least, on the debates in moral philosophy from an extra-moral, from an amoral perspective. This is the project that I'm trying to pursue. Not to criticize one morality with another morality, but to take on an amoral view, and on the basis of this, look at the certain problems we can find in various kinds of moralities.
I'm Moeller from Theology for Vidyapith, from Typical Institute of Philosophy and Religion in Pune, India. I would like to congratulate you for your clear presentation. And also, I'd like to congratulate the moderator for her inclusive morality of the lady. Thank you so much. So, my question is this, it's concerning your understanding of amorality. I do sympathize with it. I like it. And it goes along with your response earlier to not having one philosophy but many philosophies. So it's a kind of morality of pluralism, an acceptance of different understandings of morality. I see a positive point in that. My question is this: where is the role for a person who in sociological terms would be called a deviant, but from another point of view would be called a prophet. So an amoral person is living a kind of private morality. He doesn't interfere with others. That's how I think, and I live by that. But a prophet wants to change society. Not necessarily claiming that his or her morality is the morality, but wants to bring about change. Where is the role of such a person in the inclusive, in the exclusive, and the amoral three moralities that you have spoken of?
Very good question. Thank you. I haven't really reflected on that too much, but so I can only answer it on the background of things that I've reflected on. I think, well, of course, from what I said, I'm very skeptical with respect to prophets, when it comes to prophets. But, I mean, prophets, you can have prophets of any kind of morality. You can have prophets of an inclusive morality, you can have prophets of an exclusive morality. That is basically, again, from my perspective, the problem is not the particular morality that the prophet advertised, but the very problem of having prophets, right? I find prophets are problematic types. Again, both, they are potentially pathological, both individual and they can create social pathologies. I find the prophet is at least potentially dangerous figure. And again, I also, perhaps I can even go so far that this Taoist project of cultivation that I was speaking about perhaps aims at, preventing the philosopher from falling into the trap of seeing himself or wanting to or becoming a prophet. I think that's probably a danger that religious and philosophical and political figures have, that at a certain point, they somehow feel themselves as prophets. And as I say, this is something that is an inherent danger, I think, in philosophy, religion, and politics.
Okay, this ends our open forum. Once again, we would like to thank Dr. Moeller. Let's give him a generous applause. Thank you.